And we're live.
Wow. Hey, we're live.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Hi. I'm Al. This is Essa. We're going to introduce ourselves. Essa's coming in from the Bay Area, isn't it, Essa, in California?
Bay.
I'm transmatting in from I was going to say gloomy autumnal evening in Wales, but it's actually been quite a nice day today. But it's getting later in the evening, so the light's going now. But at least we don't have storms. We agreed that we'd introduce each other, so I'll just say a little bit about myself, and then I'll hand over to Essa, and then we'll get a great discussion going. I'm Al Reynolds, science fiction writer, born in Wales, been around the world a bit, and now live back in Wales. I was a space scientist, and that took me to living in Scotland and then the Netherlands for about 20 years. And that's more or less where I broke into science fiction writing. I've written around, I think, 18 novels in the last 20 years, and quite a few short stories. Most recent of my novels is the Revenger trilogy, which is I've just completed that with the novel Bone Silence, which came out earlier this year. So yeah, I'm no longer a space scientist. I retired in 2004, but I still keep an interest in science and so on. So that's me coming in from Wales. Going to hand over to Essa now.
Hey, I'm Essa. So I'm in the North Bay area of San Francisco. In my day job, I'm a sound designer for science fiction and fantasy films, and I've been writing for most of my life, but just for myself. And only the past 3 or 4 years decided that I would try and write a book for a wider audience. So November, which will be backwards for you all, is coming out in the US and UK in November. First in a trilogy. Exciting, been a crazy year.
Sure has, yeah. Well, I've read No Fake Loss, and it's a very, very accomplished debut novel. It's right up my street, actually, because it's sort of very, very far future science fiction, kind of very weird in places, which I really like, and almost sort of dances on the edge of comprehensibility at times, because you've got these sort of very arcane technologies being deployed in this amazingly rich universe of nested universes and sort of interpenetrating different micro universes and universes. And so much going on in this book, right?
And I always find myself having to kind of pare back and figure out how to get my weird thinking into something that is comprehensible by readers. So there's a lot of clarity passes at the end. But I love the challenge of trying to take something that's very abstract or very strange and sort of compartmentalize it into language that a reader can visualize or feel the emotion of.
When we chatted briefly last week, we did this sort of audio-visual test of the connection. You mentioned the clarity pass, and I'd never heard that before. I thought it was really interesting. I kind of got what you meant, and having had the experience of reading more of the book since you mentioned that, I sort of thought, yeah, I can see. It's almost as if someone's handed you a manuscript, sort of sent from 10 billion years in the future, about this really bizarre future society, which there's no very sort of task of rendering that in sort of some form that we comprehend, but it's almost sort of straining at the limits of sort of language and reality in places. It's really fantastic. I mean, it's not. I think it's a sort of you have to like that kind of thing, right, in science fiction to really get it, and you clearly do, and I clearly do as well.
Yeah, I think it easily bogs down readers that aren't ready to sort of chew on that. But like my brain, even the word choices are often non-standard. Like my default needs to be clarified later. But I got a lot of inspiration from reading. Like I actually love occult manuscripts and esoteric books and like a much more archaic language and poetry where it's sort of intentionally obscure. And there's part of what I loved about engaging that was like it's a puzzle. So like you're engaging with the language in a way to try and figure out what like this bigger concept that the author is conveying. So I think that influenced my style, but I can go too far in the other direction where no one knows what I'm
you can't
describing.
go too far. No, good. I mean, well, I would say that the sort of the way your cosmology works and the sort of the way the characters engage with the technology, it does have that sort of occult edge to it in places. And you've got sort of characters who indulge in something like astrology as well. They sort of have sort of clairvoyant properties and things like that. It's all, and we don't. I mean, I would say within the context of the first book, we don't know to what extent this is, should we say, magic, and to what extent it's the sort of outcome of just technologies that we don't understand. But it's a very a rich broth of sort of invention you've created there.
Yeah, and in your Avenger trilogy as well, like some of the technology from the ancient civilizations, some like that old alien stuff feels very almost magical. Like, in the characters in the current times don't know how they work, but the way it's described, it just seems impossible. But everything's really interesting.
Well, that's sort of saved me the trouble of working out how it works as well. But I do like that sense of science fiction, which is grounded in a real sense of deep time, and there's lots of sort of layers of history sort of underneath the story, and that certainly. I mean, I was going to ask you actually about where Nofek Gloss sort of where do you situate it? Is it actually in our future timeline? Would you say could it's something else, right?
Yeah, second world. And when I started out, I wanted to be more rigorous with the science. I was like, okay, I'm gonna get my calculations right. I'm gonna make sure that this is really plausible. But I found that it was bogging me down from the energy as I was drafting the story that I wanted, and also my early readers, what they were responding to was a sense of wonder and like the strangeness of it, and with the technology and the exotic species and things like that. So I pivoted partway through to lean heavily onto like, what new ideas can I put in? Like, what can I do that I haven't seen in science fiction before? Like, even something as simple as a spacesuit. Like, okay, we've seen so many versions of that. Like, can I think of something that is completely different and feels fresh and exciting?
Yeah, and I mean, we'll come to the spaceships at some point, but I think you've probably created the coolest spaceships in science fiction at this point. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that, but awesome. The spaceships and all the sort of paraphernalia that sort of accretes around them, the move and the way they dock. And,
and drafting the second book now, I have the challenge. I have to one up myself. So like, there's cool spaceships in this book, but what do I have to do something next that's even wilder? So I keep stretching, but I find that really
you've
fun.
made a rock for your own back there, haven't you?
Yeah.
It's really. I mean, the other thing I wanted to we're talking about the language in the books in particular. There's a use of, you were saying, like, you'll sometimes go for the unusual word choice, which I really picked up on. And it's like there's so many points in the sort of narrative where you will reach for a non-obvious descriptor or an adjective, which to me it kept a sense of freshness sort of flowing through the story. Not in the way you might describe something visually or something like that, and almost sort of shading into synesthesia. I think in places like
which I have.
Right. Okay. Well, there's a point where you describe a thunderstorm as crunchy, and I thought that was not something you're going to come across in something that's sort of formulaic slapdash prose. I mean, just to sort of cross knit between two different sort of sense systems is something that happens a lot in the text. So is that something that, yeah, go on.
I have synesthesia with sound, which contributes, but also in my day job, I'm often thinking of specifically sound, but thinking of it in terms of other qualities. So I'm paying attention to the material it's made of, the motion, like the movement that it's doing, the texture and the shape of it. So I find myself just crossing the sensory sort of wires. So if that's just how my brain works, but also the way I have to think about my creative work in film. And when I'm observing things out in nature, I'm often sort of feeling it in multiple modalities. So I think when I'm using language to try to convey something, the event in my brain is like has multiple dimensions to it. So the word that I might pick might be something other than the standard.
I think that comes through brilliantly in your prose and the way you describe this invented world. And I think it just takes it to another level in terms of the sort of richness of the imagery. I mean, there's another bit where you will remember it better than I do. But I think it's Cadence looking into this sort of cryo container thing, and there's a smaller box inside it with cables coming out of it, and you say they sort of waterfall out of it. Yeah, and it's just such a brilliant sort of piece of descriptive shorthand.
And I do wonder sometimes, like, if the way my visual works, like, is that what the reader, like, am I successfully building the same visual in the reader the way that I see it through the words that I'm using? I think sometimes it's effective, and sometimes I probably miss the mark, which is where my clarity pass is important.
I think as writers, sorry, I was going to say we never really know to the extent to which we do build that picture in the reader's mind, but we have to trust that a certain portion of readers do get that sort of telecommunication.
And I have good critique partners that will help tell me. They'll be like, I have no idea what you're describing here, or like, this is really evocative and powerful. So I know that'll help me weed or know when I get too into my own weeds.
I don't always want to understand what I'm reading. I'm quite happy to sort of skate along on the surface of something that's kind of sort of weirdly incomprehensible.
Yeah,
if I can still sense the sort of general drift of the story, I say, okay, I'll come back to that later. But that is very much for me part of the allure of science fiction, and goes back to what hooked me into science fiction when I was younger. So I'm going to backtrack a bit. I mean, you say you've been writing for a very long time. What was your route into science fiction? What are your influences?
So I can say I've been storytelling since I was very, very little, in all kinds of mediums. So putting on plays and dressing up and painting and being out in nature and sort of acting out stories. And writing was part of that as well. And I had, read science fiction and fantasy as a kid and escaped into those worlds all the time. And I think when I was a teenager was when I really got more serious into writing, and, sort of had that switch from reading to writing, where like, oh, I can, I have a medium for my imagination, and I can, create worlds and have it put down here on paper. But I was always just writing for myself, and it was my passion, and I loved it, and I didn't feel the need to share it or have outside evaluation of it. It was me living in these worlds and building stories and characters and environments that were in my head. So I just sort of ran with that, and I couldn't consume all of my time, and I'd be completely happy, and no one needed to pay me for it. I just loved it. And it wasn't till recently, like I said, that it sort of seemed like a new challenge to really try and, not just meander with my storytelling in the worlds that I'm making, but to really try and make a manuscript and try and make like a complete whole and polish that to be able to share. So seizing that challenge was what sort of drove me towards publishing.
Yeah. I mean, I had a sort of switch for me was when I was about 16, and like you, I'd written a lot of sort of science fiction for my own self-edification, really. Just couldn't stop writing stories, and I'd written. I wrote a novel a bit earlier in my teens, and then by the time I was 18, but again, I wasn't interested in sharing the world. Around about 16, I sort of realized that there was this sort of process where you could write short stories and use them as stepping stones to getting some sort of interest in a novel, because I became aware of sort of like the career trajectories of other science fiction writers through reading anthologies and sort of the notes that accompany the stories. So I started then trying a bit more focused and disciplined about maybe being a writer rather than just doing kind of fill the time sort of thing. But for me, it was a long. Well, because it was a long process then before I actually got anything into print.
Did you find any of your older, younger ideas sort of came back around into your narrative, or that you maybe cannibalized some of those ideas, or are you always just moving forward with new things?
Oh, I've cannibalized tons of things, yeah, because I think partly because I'm fond of the things I wrote when I was younger, and I quite like mining them. So it's not so much narrative ideas, but like character names, planet names. They all, I've stripped the first 2 novels I wrote, which will never be published, but I've strip mined them for lots of stuff that's appeared in later books, even as recently as Bones Style. The name of the alien that they pick up and transport on the ship, Tazaknakak, is from the novel I wrote when I was 13, and it was just that sort of a tip of the hat to my younger self in a way. And it's not meant to signify anything beyond that, but it just gives me a little glow of pleasure. But yeah, I wrote a lot, and it was journeyman work, and I was sort of working through my ideas and trying to think about how I wrote stuff that didn't feel formulaic. Because when I first started writing science fiction, my key influences, I mean, I'd read a little, Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and Philip K. Dick and a few other obvious big names. But all the other stuff sort of filling my head was sort of Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek. And my first novel was just an unholy melange of sort of vaguely intelligent SF, but also loads of sort of, big, stupid stuff that I just nicked from Battlestar Galactica.
Right.
And I haven't really organized the two sort of influences.
Well, the Revenger trilogy, so I'm halfway through Shadow Captain, but they feel like there's that, like I said, almost magical aspect of some of the technology and the civilizations, but it also feels very grounded. And you're an astrophysicist, so I'm wondering how much time did you spend on the accuracy of your story or bouncing scientific detail that doesn't distract from the narrative? How's that a balance for you?
Well, I'd written a fair number of books and stories which I suppose were grounded in something like real science, with relativity and quantum physics and sort of science as I know it. And I did want to do something a little bit different for the Revenger trilogy. I wanted to make it a little bit more steampunky and swashbuckling-y sort of. And also, I'd spent a lot of time, particularly with the books I wrote before that, working out sort of logistics of travel times between different solar systems with sort of 1G of acceleration and relativity and all this. And I really enjoy doing all that, and it's bread and butter to me as a writer. But now and again, you think, wouldn't it be great if it could just be like Han Solo, and they just decide to go to a planet and they get there in a reasonably convenient time frame? So I thought, what if all the points that, all the sort of locations in my universe were all within the solar system, then I would never have to worry about the speed of light. I could just say, well, you just sort of drift around and it takes a few weeks to get anywhere. So that was the sort of genesis of the thinking behind the Revenger universe. So it's like, rather than a whole galaxy of planets, it's just one. It's our solar system. It's millions of years in the future, and the existing planets have been dismantled, made into this enormous sort of crumbling Dyson swarm of little micro worldlets, some of which have got black holes in, so they can have sort of an illusion of gravity on the surface, or real gravity. And I did all the maths for that. I sort of worked out the total mass of all the planets, which is basically just Jupiter. Count. But you just sort of take Jupiter and you sort of figure out how many sort of micro worldlets you can make, and you need to save some mass over for creating miniature black holes. So you work out how many, what sort of size of black hole you want, which depends on the diameter of the little micro world, and then you just do the equations and calculate how many of these things you can reasonably have. And that's, I mean, I won't say that's as much as complicated as the sort of world building got, but it's not far off that. And I thought, well, if the Earth the Earth takes a year to go around the sun. So if all the action takes place within a volume about that size, then my rule of thumb for the navigation in the Revenger books was that if the ship has to get from one side of the congregation to the other, it takes about a year, and any other all other voyages are on the order of weeks or months. So it's kind of hand wavy, and it's also sort of harking back to the sort of nautical fiction that I really enjoy. Patrick O'Brien and people like that, where you might take weeks to go around the Cape Horn or something like that, but it's not years and years. So yeah, a conscious choice to sort of throttle back the science a bit and have a little bit more piratey fun.
Yeah, I quickly gave up on deciding on FTL or not, and just went the wormhole kind of route. Just put gates, and especially since the world is so gigantic, like you have bubble universes encompassing whole galaxies, and but I also realized partway through writing that I had made like the ultimate hand-waving excuse. I can just say, oh, the laws of physics work different in this universe, so that science is actually fine.
Well, actually, that then becomes a plot driver as well, doesn't it? Within the book as well, like the fact that not all the characters and creatures in this universe are comfortable within all the universes, and that then generates lots of interesting sort of curlicues within the story that you can play with and expand on.
Yeah, that was what I found idea-wise really interesting about the bubble multiverse to begin with. I was like thinking in terms of exploration and trading, like the implications, which I didn't have time to get into in the book, but like you could take, say you mine an indestructible material on an asteroid in one universe, and you take that to another universe where it becomes a liquid. Maybe you pour that into casts, and then take it to another universe where it recrystallizes, and then you take it somewhere else where it sells for a lot. The whole kind of economy of transformations of matter and energy is really exciting idea that I hope I put into the book without actually deviating to try and go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, it sort of works because one of the sort of big sort of narrative problems with science fiction is working out what commodity could possibly be useful enough to transport across interstellar distances. And with your sort of the varying physics of the sort of different universes, you kind of come up with something that works in sort of logical terms as well. Yeah.
And now when I'm trying to sort of, as I was saying, one up my weird ideas in the next book, that's one thing I can lean on and be like, oh, what can I make, change? I love using transformations as a way to sort of propel narrative. Things don't stay the same.
Yeah. I'm just going to lean in and check the clock here because I want to make sure. I mean, do you think we should start? There's so many things we could talk about that we ought to just maybe look at the questions. So we've got nine here, haven't we? And we're gonna sort of take these both if you're okay.
Do you want to start?
Well, there's one for me right at the top, but it's not going to be fair if it's just questions for me, is it? So I'll take it quickly. I'm really interested.
I'll ask one for you.
Yeah, I'll do mine and then we'll do yours.
Yeah.
Okay, go on then.
From Jonathan. For Mr. Reynolds, in the RS series, do you imagine that any attempt was made to warn Sol, Yellowstone, or Sky's Edge of the inhibitors?
Well, hello, Jonathan. Thank you for the question. I'm right now. I'm writing a big book which sort of returns to that whole universe and the sort of world building of it. And I'm playing with the after effects of the sort of inhibitor attacks on those solar systems. So you will find some answers to your questions in the next book. I'm not going to say too much more, but I'm sort of thinking through the implications of that. In the Revelation Space book, there are these robot sort of alien things out in the galaxy that hunt down any spacefaring civilizations and trying to kill them. So that's the inhibitors. So I'm playing with those ideas, but also struggling with the fact that I wrote it sort of 18 years ago as well. So it's sort of like I'm trying to reboot my own universe in my head and try not to sort of build in too many inconsistencies. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to throw a question to Essa now. For Essa, and this is from Xiao Ling. I hope I'm pronouncing the name properly. My apologies if I have not. For Essa, is there anything you've learned as a sound designer that has affected how you tell your own stories? And this is something this is a 2-for-1, because I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about sound design and the creative
Yeah,
process. Oh.
thanks for the question. So as I mentioned before, just the way that I think about sound in different sensory modalities and in terms of motion and texture and shape, I think informs the type of language that I often reach for in my prose. So I should back up. As a sound designer for film, my job is to, main job is to create from other recordings and library source sounds that don't exist. So the spaceship engine, the alien vocals, the mythical creature, the magic, the technology and all of that we can't just, I can't rush out with a recorder and collect that sound. We have to make it from other things. One of the requests that I get all the time is it needs to be weirder. It needs to sound like nothing we've ever heard before. The clients always want something that's like fresh and unique and, not derivative. So like, it should sound like a lightsaber, but not like a lightsaber. So I think that's gotten my brain constantly in the gear of trying to think outside the box and like reach for something different, and not keep doing the same ideas of my own or someone else's all the time. So I think ideas wise, it's definitely trained me to think weirder and stranger and non-standard.
May I ask, sorry to interject, but when you create a sound, do you go to a existing sound source? I might be wrong, but I seem to remember reading that when they did Star Wars, like the noises of the TIE fighters are sort of, they're like orangutans or something like that, sort of sped up. Or are you just dealing in sort of pure, digital data that doesn't exist in any real world context?
Yeah, there's sort of two approaches. Organic, where you're using real world sounds and manipulating them, either by how you're cutting them together and or processing them through plugins and things, or you go completely synthesis. So you're synthesizing the sound from nothing, from those digital bits, and sometimes blending the two. But my approach is very much organic. So I'll get the orangutan or the elephant and the water and the fire and start kind of mixing things. And I really like choosing an unusual source for something else. So like in Doctor Strange, there's these portals that are sort of built of sparks kind of going around. And I didn't really use very much fire for it, even though it looks fiery. I like picking something else so that I think it does something subliminally in your brain when you're matching a sound that looks like it fits, but it's actually from a different source. I think it makes it more grounded in the scene, especially when it's visual effects that is pasted in there.
Oh, do you feel that as a sound designer, you maybe don't? Oh,
go ahead.
You frozen there. I don't know if we've had a glitch there, but if you can still hear me, I was wondering, do you feel that sound designers in general maybe don't get the the recognition that, say, the visual effects artists do? Well, I don't know if anyone can still hear me. Okay, we seem to have lost Essa's connection here. So presuming that I'm still online, I'm just going to look at maybe a question that's specifically for me. There's a question here from Dan Trevethan. And Dan asks, now that the Revenger trilogy is wrapped up, what are you working on next, Mr. Reynolds? Well, thank you for the question, Dan. As I mentioned just now, okay, yeah, people are saying that they can hear me, which is very good. Thank you. Dan, I'm working on a new novel in the Revelation Space universe, which is, my intention is that it's a standalone. It's not part of the Prefect Dreyfus sequence, although I do intend to write another Dreyfus novel before too long. I'm writing a book that takes place after the events of Absolution Gap at the moment. So it deals with the sort of aftermath of the sort of battle between humans and inhibitors which begins in that book. But it's very much structured as a novel that you could come to if you hadn't read any of the others. And I'm trying to, as I'm writing it, I'm trying to avoid spoilers about the identities and fates of various characters in the earlier books. But I'm having fun with it, and I hope that it will be a good return to that universe for me. Anyway, I'm certainly enjoying digging back into it. The provisional title for the book at the moment is War and Glass, and hopefully that will remain the title. So, thank you, Dan. Still waiting to see if Essa is able to connect. Usually I'm the one with the flaky internet. Just looking at a couple more questions here. Okay, so this is one for both authors, but if Essa reconnects, we can both take it.
I hope.
Hello there. Is that Angela again? Or was it Essa? I've got to move my window. Got my Q&A
We've switched
window.
places on my screen.
Oh, it's Essa. Good, because I had that Q&A window open and it was sort of blocking. I couldn't see who was there. Oh, good.
Yes,
Great. Are you okay?
Yes. I think internet's just up and down around here.
Yeah, I was just going to take a question that we can both answer, and I'm just trying to get my windows have all gone weird now. So this is a question from Holger Michael. Hi, Holger, and it says, for both authors, recent events have been even weirder than usual. Pandemic, rise of alternative fact-fueled populism. Is this reflected in your writing? Well, I think we can both take a stab at that. What do you reckon?
Well, not in my first book, since I finished writing it before all of this. We were actually writing it, wrapping it up when the pandemic hit. So it's not reflected in there. And my second book was already kind of on the go ideas-wise before all this. But it's definitely churning in my brain more in my short story mind. Those themes sort of keep coming up. And I think short stories, I'm not great at short stories and I don't get ideas very often, but it feels like that's where my personal feelings about Earth and where we're headed and like the current climate, both, actual environmental climate and socio-political climate, those ideas sort of come up in the short stories more than my long form fiction. What about you?
Well, I think you're sort of, one of the things that became more and more concrete to me as I was reading No Fair Gloss was it's quite an angry book as well. It's driven by a real sense of, I don't want to use the word social justice because it's a real sort of trigger for the right, isn't it? But there's a strong sense of it in this book. It's about abuses of power, hierarchical structures that have been doing sort of nefarious things, and it's a relevant book, I think, in that sense.
It is, and it wasn't my intention to, I wasn't directly responding to anything current, but I think, again, taking an abstract idea and sort of a very generalized feeling that can apply to a lot of different personal experiences and zeitgeist, so that readers can respond to it in their own way as they're reading, and it's not like not on a soapbox.
No, it's not a polemic. Fundamentally it's just a very engaging story, but it's sort of truths come through it anyway. Yeah. Well, and for me, you've disappeared, Essa, but I think you're still there, aren't you?
I'm still here.
Good.
If you can hear me, I'm still here.
The pandemic, for me, is sort of, I think it's kind of crept up slowly in a way, because the sort of day-to-day life of the average sort of full-time writer, and I know being a full-time writer is a very privileged position, and I'm not in any sense taking that lightly, but most of my life is a bit like being in lockdown anyway. I live in rural Wales, don't get out that much because I quite like living at home, and my wife and I have a lovely a nice house with a nice garden, lots of wildlife around. We've got all the sort of creature comforts at home. So initially, at least, I didn't find it jolting to be forced into sort of confinement at home, and I just carried on writing. But I think as the months wore on, there was a sort of sense of I did feel my creative juices starting to ebb a little bit, particularly as we went into the sort of late summer. So I have found it, I mean, difficult on a personal level, but also just the way the world is at the moment. It's very distracting in all senses.
Yeah, and
Particularly in the
especially
UK.
like as a debut, it feels like we need fiction right now very strongly, but it feels weird to promote yourself when there's so much else going on that seems more important. Like stories are really important, but I'm like, please read my book, and everything's on fire. It feels like an odd time.
Yeah, but this is when people need fiction, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, there's a gentleman I know through science fiction who there was a conversation that was going on about the sort of the pros and cons of reading for escapism, and he said, well, I'm a conflict. My day job is sort of conflict resolution in the Balkans. So damn right, I'm going to read for escapism. And I apologize. People who know science fiction will know who I'm referring to. But he made a very sort of good case that there's nothing at all to be apologized for in terms of reading during times of stress.
Yeah.
And I so absolutely we need good books, and we need good science fiction. And No Fake Loss is exactly the right book for people to read right now. And I think people will enjoy it. They will find escapism in it, but also much to think about. It's a book that's it's situated in this sort of very alien future, but at the same time, there's sort of basic human truths sort of ringing through it.
And that was one of my intentions. Yeah. One of my intentions from the beginning is to put these little nuggets in that get the reader thinking, or maybe resonate with their experience in a way that goes a little deeper than just that little bit in the book. But to put those sort of generalized little resonant pieces in.
Yeah, and on the face of it, the story is actually quite relatable, isn't it? Because it's your central character is screwed over by the powers that be, and it's their journey towards some sort of justice, and that's sort of
right.
it's as old as the Count of Monte Cristo. So it's. Let's just have another look at the questions as we run out of time.
All right.
Good one from Sunny right at the top here. I'm seeing it at the top as well. I don't know what sort of.
Yeah.
So Sunny asks for both. Yeah, do you want to take this one, Essa?
Yeah, for both. What kind of science inspires your world building? Why don't you go first?
Well, thank you, Sunny. I was a scientist, but I honestly think that's sort of orthogonal to my output as a science fiction writer. I think I'd basically be writing the same type of stuff, whether I'd done an art degree. And I very nearly studied art instead of science fiction. There'd be but I don't think it would have made a vast difference to the type of stuff I write, because my sort of interests and concerns were sort of baked in when I was very young. I read. Once I stopped being a scientist, I lost all connection with the sort of professional scientific literature, which was always boring anyway. It's never terrible. Reading papers is like the worst torture imaginable. But I do read the popular scientific press. I read New Scientist once a week, and it's full of, up to date, sometimes a little bit debatable science, if you want it, because it's breaking news. And I also read Scientific American, which is a little bit more formal, maybe a little bit duller, but it has really good review articles which sort of give you the state of knowledge in a particular field. And it could be anything from, I don't just read the cosmology stuff. I actually I'm really into articles about neuroscience or genetics or paleontology. And I try and read omnivorously throughout the year, and I don't read with the specific intention of researching a particular science fiction story. I just let it all mulch down, and then at some point when I am writing a story, something will remind me of a nugget of science I might have read about a year ago, and then I will go back and sort of fact check myself, make sure I'm right about what I thought I read. But specifically about world building, that's a good one. I suppose on the astronomical scale, I try and think about the way that life in the universe might coexist, and how ecosystems work in terms of planets and stars and what you can have and what you can't have. Try not to sort of fall into any obvious pitfalls, like having certain types of star aren't really sufficiently long-lived, that one would expect life to have a chance of evolving around them. So those kind of world-building constraints are sort of always at the forefront when I'm thinking about science fiction. Essa?
Yeah, for world building, so I really like that cutting edge science, like the front fringe, the theoretical physics, quantum physics, and all this sort of new cosmology and the ideas that aren't really proven yet, but are sort of more creative for my world building. And as well as things like I always tend to go back to biotech a lot and biological sciences, fluid dynamics. I spend a lot of time in nature, so I get a lot of inspiration from just the forms in nature and weather patterns and natural things like that. But yeah, the cutting edge science really interests me, and I find it's harder to put, like, if I use the accurate terms in my book, like I know what I'm talking about, but it just seems so like no one else, their brain isn't there. I had a physicist critique partner, and he's like, I don't know the science you're talking about. It's like, oh no, I have to dial it back and kind of go back to my weird language to try and evoke the same thing. I can't actually use the terms.
And there was one word I picked up. Yeah. I was going to say, I really love the fact you use, what's that word that means the smell you get after a thunderstorm?
Petrichor.
Petrichor, isn't it?
I love that word.
Yeah, I love that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and I find that I'll often stumble upon science after I've already had the idea, and then I'll loop around and weave it into my world building after the fact. So I have this bubble multiverse, and then just recently I was binging a bunch of World Science Festival videos, and they were going over the holographic principle and inflationary multiverse theory, where these sort of branching off bubble universes, and species like human can only survive in a universe that with physics compatible with humans. I'm like, that's where my brain was before. So I can kind of loop in some real science that supports the concept that I'd bubbled up previously. But I often find that I will come across a science after my brain has already gone to a weird place, and then I can sort of bolster the weirdness with something more tangible, make it feel concrete.
So that sounds like we have a sort of similar in terms of the sort of shape of the narrative comes first, the storytelling constraints, and then the science is folded in, not as an afterthought, but the story is principle, isn't it? Rather than starting from the science, building out the story. I mean, I've tried that, and it doesn't work for me creatively. I always have to have the story, and then sort of braid the science into it as best I can. I think approach is very similar, actually.
Get another question?
Yeah.
The one at the top for me is from Travis.
Yes, let's go on that one, shall we? Travis Tippins. Hi, Travis. What book has had the most influence on your careers as a writer? You can take that one, Essa, while I think about my answer.
This question is always tough for me. I hear other authors answer it, and they always have like a Keystone book. They always have a Keystone book or some turning point in their young reading. It was like the book that opened their eyes or sent them on a trajectory. And I don't know that I have that one book that was influential. I remember sort of mid-teens, I wasn't discovering the books that I think I would have loved at that time. Like I lived very remotely. We didn't have a bookstore in town, and the library was quite a ways away. And I didn't have peers that were feeding me books. So I sort of had very small inlets and had to search very hard to find fiction. So I wasn't getting recommendations of things that I think I would have loved then. I read them later. So my reading was very limited, and I was feeling like everything was the same. the same kind of style, the same kind of story and tropes. And I came across Ian Banks' Fearsome Engine, which has like 5 very, very different points of view and some very unique styles of prose. Like one character is written completely phonetically, and it does a little something funny with your brain. But that book, I think, opened my mind to like, there's a very different way of doing this writing thing than what I had been reading. So I always remember that one kind of got me back into reading after a slump of sort of turning to writing because I wasn't finding what I wanted in fiction. So that one turned me back to like, I gotta find more books because what he's done here is very cool.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, there's many books I could name, but there was one of Ian's novels also had a sort of pivotal influence on me at a particular point in my life. And I'd already been published as a short fiction writer, but I wasn't really sure where I was going with the sort of between being a writer and a scientist. And I at one point I had a job interview, and I had to come back to the UK, and I wasn't all that enthusiastic about returning to the UK because my partner lives in the Netherlands, and I quite like the Netherlands. And on the way back from the interview, I was in an airport lounge waiting for my flight, and Ian Banks's Accession had just been published. It was a culture novel, another science fiction novel. I think it may have been the one that came after Fearsome Engine. It was a year or two after that, I think. And I just sort of, and I was going to buy it anyway because I was a big fan of Banks, and I wanted. At that point, I was trying to get them all in hardcover as well. I love the design, the book designs as well. And I remember just sitting down with Accession in the departure lounge, just sort of reading the first couple of chapters, and it just sort of like an epiphany, like, why the hell would you want to be anything other than a science fiction writer, Reynolds? Because the sense of play that was just sort of boiling off the pages, the sort of immense fun that Banks was having with this universe, just hit me. And I remember thinking, no, I've got to. It's got to be the writing has got to take precedence. So I went back to the Netherlands, and I declined the job I'd been interviewed for. I sort of phoned them up and said, look, I was crap in the interview, but I don't want it anyway, which was great. But they sort of said, yeah, we could tell you weren't sort of fully committed. And I just thought I'd rather be unemployed, but trying to be a writer than employed back in the UK. So, and then as luck would have it, or fate would have it, another science job sort of landed in my lap not long after. So I was able to stay employed as a scientist in the Netherlands for about another 7 years. But Accession was a real, road to Damascus moment in my thinking about myself in professional writing terms anyway. And I'd always been indebted to Ian. I got to tell him that as well. I told him the book had really sort of had a big impact. And I wasn't sort of understating it, and I really meant it. That I think Accession sort of hit me at exactly the right point to sort of validate my aspirations to be a science fiction writer.
Awesome.
Thank you, Travis. And Fearsome Engine is brilliant as well, isn't it? It's a really good book, Fearsome Engine.
Yeah,
and you're right about those weird phonetic bits in it.
My older brother is dyslexic.
No trouble with that.
I didn't. I could breeze right through, but one of my brothers is dyslexic, and he was like, "This is not. This is all gibberish." But just
can't remember if that's the one where you kind of have to read it. Do you read it in Scots dialect, and it sort of makes more sense? I can't remember that.
It has its own sort of sound once you get in the rhythm of it. But just like you're saying, like the play, the creativity of like, this is what we can do in this genre, or even with language itself, is really inspiring at the right time.
There's a question for you, Essa, from Eduardo. Do you want to have a look at that one?
Sure. Thank you, Eduardo.
Shall I read it?
Yeah.
This is for Essa. For Essa Hansen. You mentioned that you were influenced by reading books on the occult and trying to choose non-standard terms. I could be wrong, but it seemed that a poetic approach to writing might help with this kind of evocative style. Are you influenced by much poetry, and if so, which poets? And that's from Eduardo.
Great question. I'm not sure if I could list one or more poets specifically, but I've definitely spent a long time sort of collecting poems that resonated with me. Usually more the content of it than one poet's particular style, but there would be some idea or some turn of language or some visual in it that was really evocative. And I also spent a lot of time doing poetry myself, and not actually studying it properly, but putting down language in a form that wasn't narrative prose, and trying to twist the language and find words that invoked what I wanted without it being sort of the standard narrative style. And I often go back to those and take little snippets up of the flow of consciousness sort of style, and pick little snippets and use them again or elaborate them into bigger ideas. But definitely poetic. And I really love lyrical prose, and I enjoy purple prose that's really lush and beautiful. This Is How You Lose the Time War was a recent one that I found really, really gorgeous. Just the prose of it was, and stopping at lines and reading it again, like, oh, super lush. But yeah, poetry has been a big influence for a long time, even though I haven't actually gone to learn the format myself. I've definitely tend that direction. All right, shall I grab another one?
That makes perfect sense, I think. Yeah, go
on. Lucy asks, what book are you currently reading / listening to for enjoyment? I'm reading.
Shall I take this one first?
Okay,
no, go on.
I'm not liking Shadow Captain.
But not necessarily for enjoyment.
It is. I'm enjoying it. Well, the Revenger left off at a perfect spot. The setup that you got to is so cool that I immediately dove into the next ones. Like, I got to see where they go from here. I'm also reading
thank you very much.
A critique Carter's book that comes out later from Al Hess called Coltsmith. He has a series of cozy post-apocalyptic fiction in future America, which is really enjoyable. What about you?
My reading, I've just finished No Fake Gloss, which I mentioned, and which I thoroughly endorse. Commend to all good people. Deserves to be a difficult time for a debut novelist, I think, and anything that we can do to get the sort of signal boost on a very good novel. And I'm looking forward to the next one as well, by the way. But my sort of, I mean, prior to that, I read Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time, which had come out a few years ago. But I'm always behind the curve, I'm always 2 or 3 years behind all the. I mean, Essa just mentioned This Is How You Lose the Time War, which has been a much lauded and much discussed novella or short novel this year, and I absolutely will get round to it, but it'll probably be sort of 2022 or something before I catch up with all the stuff that's kind of buzzy in 2019, 2020. I mean, I tend to sort of, particularly when I'm knee deep in a novel, one of my own novels, I do tend to lose interest in fiction, and particularly science fiction and sort of fantastic. I don't really want to go near. So I tend to sort of gravitate towards reading sort of medical memoirs and books about neurosurgery, or and my other sort of comfort reading is sort of stories about horrible catastrophes on Everest and K2, that kind of stuff. But I like reading mountaineering literature. And gory medical literature for fun, yeah. And then every now and again, I mean, if I'm writing science fiction, then the type of fiction that I would probably pick off the shelf would be more likely to be, say, a crime novel, say an Ian Rankin or something like that. A good, well-constructed, grippy crime novel. That would be the kind of. I mean, I'd probably pick one up, because I've just finished No Fake Gloss. I'll probably pick a crime novel tonight. I mean, I also like stuff like John Grisham. I know it's like it seems like people say John Grisham, you think he's like the lowest common denominator sort of airport fiction, but he's really good. I really enjoy the sort of, they're really well for what they are, they're really brilliantly constructed, thoughtful novels, and they sort of take you somewhere. So I'll also read, say, a John Grisham novel or something like that. But again, there's a mountain of really good stuff that I need to catch up on.
Yeah, I'm behind too. I get a lot of recommendations of older classic fiction that I missed. So I'll put those on my list, and then there are great new books coming out, so I'll put those on my list, and it's hard to pick what's next.
Well, I mean, there's been this sort of big sort of discussion in science fiction recently about how we should value the canon. You know, is it really, you know, do you have to go back and read, you know, Fritz Lieber or Kornbluth and Asimov to consider yourself a well-rounded science fiction reader? And of course, I think the obvious answer is no. You can just stick to reading the cool new stuff. That's fine. And if at some point you want to dig into the older stuff, by all means do so. But you know, if you were, you know, if someone was interested in reading crime fiction, you wouldn't say, well, you've got to go and read Wilkie Collins, or you won't understand the sort of, you know, anything about crime fiction. It would be ludicrous. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think people should just read what they like. If you wanted, you know, the deep cuts of fiction, they're still there for you. I mean, there's a ton of classic science fiction I've never read, I will read. So yeah.
Same. Should we do a couple more questions?
Good.
I'll grab one for you.
Okay.
This one's from Kyle. For Mr. Reynolds. In the first Revenger book, Hero goes from having no experience to expert bone reader in what seemed like a short period of time. How long were they training on the ship before the encounter with Bosa? Do you remember timelines?
Hi, Kyle. Well, I remember. I don't remember the ins and outs, but I think that the voyage that takes towards the encounter with. But I first draft Revenge, that whole build up from to going out, getting the ropes of Spacefarer, and meeting this dreaded space pirate. That just took way too long. I mean, it was just like way too much stuff. And it was. I wanted the novel to be quite short. I wanted it to be about 100,000 words, and it ended up being 140, which is still a lot shorter than most of my books. And I just felt I just needed to cut a lot of fat from the first third of the book. So I was fairly ruthless. So there was an awful lot of toing and froing on the ship where they learn the ropes, gradually introduced into the skulls, how they work. And I just said, I'm just getting rid of all that. And you know, it's several weeks have passed. As a writer, there's always that sense of does that work for the reader? Does the reader get the same sense of time? Does it all feel rushed? I have even I have a hard time judging that when I'm writing whether the pace of events. So
it's a tricky craft to compress time in a book and make it feel like a long time has passed, when really you're just taking a handful of paragraphs to sort of skip ahead, but making it feel like a lot has gone on.
It's really easy in cinematic terms, isn't it? Because they'll just have a montage with a pop song and sort of autumn leaves coming down or something like that, you know, and they, you know, yep. we know we're 6 months in the future, but how, you know, in literary terms, it's kind of difficult to do that in a way that feels seamless within the narrative. And I'm still sort of trying to figure out the sort of the best way to do that.
Yeah, I find it much easier to slow down a scene and get really into it and make it feel intimate than to take a long span of time and sort of condense it and go by really fast and make it still feel like a lot has happened.
I find as well, until I've written a novel, I don't really have a sense of the mechanics of how much time I need for various things to happen. So there's an awful lot of rejigging and massaging of the text to try and get sort of events to line up. Thank you, Kyle, by the way. Thank you for that. And we're at 1 hour. How are you feeling, Essa? Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm not in a hurry.
We'll take one or two more questions, then I'm going to have my dinner. It's quite late in Wales. and there's a question from Ollie here for both of us. Regarding inspiration, have either of you written anything inspired by? Thank you, Ollie, and looking forward to Essa's forthcoming novel. Well, you should look forward to it. It's great. Do you want to take that one first, Essa?
Yeah, inspired by a dream. I'm going to say no, but I also daydream a lot. So daydreams for sure. My brain will kind of take an idea and run off with it. And this is how I get ideas from science as well. I'll be reading something and then a line or, some words will trigger something and my brain will just kind of dream off with it for a while, or I'll have to jot it down so I don't forget. And, some story thing or world building thing will bubble off of it. But I've never actually dreamed about my books or characters. I've dreamed about other books and characters, but never my own. I don't know if that's just me or a writerly thing. How about you?
I mean, as a rule, no, but I've had a couple of, I do have quite a vivid dream life, and a lot of it's quite sort of weird, sort of horror and stuff like that sort of goes on in my head. I've had a specific dream that I think fed into Diamond Dogs, which was a novella I did a fair while ago, and it was a very sort of gothic horror, sort of Edgar Allan Poe type dream. Quite unpleasant. It's one of those dreams where you wake up and go, "Oh, thank God, that's a dream." And then I had another one about just being on a spaceship. Wow! Imagine me having a dream about being on a spaceship. That happens about every other night. But I was on a spacecraft that was accelerating away from the Earth and going into sort of time dilation and relativistic speeds. And I woke up with a real visceral sense of what that would mean in terms of, every second that you experience on the ship puts you further and further away from your home, and you can never go back, because by the time you get back, centuries will have passed on that planet. And I must have thought about that 1,000 times in sort of coldly analytic terms as a writer, but just having the sort of experience of sort of living through it in a dream when it was actually happening to me definitely triggered something. I think that kind of fed into maybe House of Suns, because they have the sort of characters who go around the galaxy in relativistic starships, and they might visit a planet and they'll know it'll be sort of 200,000 years before they come back to it, because they go all the way around the galaxy, and there's no way that anything that they've seen there will be there when they come back. There's probably been others. Yeah, I mean, I woke up. I mean, just not quite a dream, but I woke up about 3 weeks ago with an idea for a fully formed space opera, which doesn't happen very often, that kind of thing. But I woke up with a clear set. I mean, I think it's one of those things where I've been trying to think about an idea for a space opera for for at least 2 years, and I think it's that thing of the gears of the subconscious are sort of working all the time, and then eventually something kind of gets sort of spat out into the sort of conscious levels of the brain. And it just so happened that it was as I woke up in bed, and I thought, yes, I got that one. Yeah, but it's not something.
Do you have to rush to write it down, or will you retain it?
No, I mean, I probably should write it down, but I tend to work on the principle that it's no point. You don't need to write down the good ideas, because they sort of get their hooks into you. I don't think I've ever forgotten a good idea. They just grab you, and they're so they demand to be written in a way that there's no way I'm going to forget it. I will at some point start writing notes, generating a deeper sense of the story I want to tell. But there's no danger of me forgetting the narrative, because it's sort of, I was excited by it when I woke up, and I'm excited by it 3 weeks later. So I'm not going to forget it in a hurry. It goes in the queue of things I'd like to write about at some point.
It's a good measure. Here's a quick question for you from Eduardo. Is there one book of yours that you would recommend to someone who is new to your writing?
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Essa, for the question as well. That's a hard one, isn't it? I mean, you see your own work from the other side. You don't see it from the point of view of someone coming to it. If pushed pushed to give an answer, I tend to fall back on one of my standalone novels, because the idea is as a reader, you're only committing to one book, and you don't have to read anything else. The book I just mentioned in connection with the dream, House of Suns, it's a book I'm still pleased with, and I think it works quite well as an introduction to my style. It's a self-contained story. You don't have to read anything else. There are one or two other bits of fiction connected to the universe, but they're not obligatory. So that, yeah, House of Suns is maybe a good one, particularly if you've got a taste for very far future science fiction. It's my sort of deep time novel, and one that I'm still fond of. Yeah, so House of Suns is usually my fallback answer. Thank you, Eduardo.
Very cool.
I wonder if we should consider wrapping things up, Essa. How do you feel?
Yeah, you gotta get your dinner.
Yeah, because it's 9 o'clock here in Wales, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's lunchtime here.
Thanks to the miracle of telecommunications. It's amazing that we can do this in the first place, I think.
Yes, and thanks for agreeing to it. It's been an awesome talk.
I've got one more question. Do you want to say a little bit about the next book? You said you're doing edits on it now. Is that correct?
Yes, I finished the first draft, so I'm diving into revision. It's a lot weirder, and I go more into sort of the quantum physics stuff that I love, and the weird exploration of consciousness and identity, and there's some body swapping and interesting things going on. I don't know how much I can say without spoiling it, but that'll be out next October.
So when is the official publication date for No Fek Gloss?
November 17th.
Okay, so great. So not too long to wait.
Yeah, a couple months.
Is that in the States or
It'll
UK
be
as well?
US and UK on the 17th, but I think the paperback in the UK is that Thursday that same week, since your release date is a little different than ours.
Good. Okay. And then a year later, we get the follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have a title?
I don't think I can share the title yet. I think it'll be secret.
Okay. Yeah, good answer.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you, Essa.
Thank you, Al, and thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, good luck. Thank you, everyone, as well. Thanks for all the great questions. I apologize that we didn't get to all of them. Time just flies, but they're all appreciated, and perhaps some other time we'll get to answer some more questions. So Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah.